The revolving doors of the Carter Grand Hotel spun slowly as Beth Carter stepped into the elegant marble-floored lobby. At 32, she wasn't someone most people would expect to see at a five-star hotel in downtown Portland, at least not dressed the way she was. Her faded jeans bore smudges of dried paint, and her soft gray t-shirt showed signs of long use. A light denim jacket clung to her shoulders, and a well-worn trucker cap sat low over her neatly tied ponytail. Her dark skin glowed faintly under the chandelier's golden light, but what truly made her stand out was her quiet confidence, not her clothes. Beth had just finished a 10-hour day teaching art to underprivileged children at a community center on the city's east side. Her feet ached, her back was stiff, and she still had the faint scent of turpentine on her hands. The drive home, nearly 2 hours away into the countryside, felt impossible at this hour. So when her husband, Richard Carter, suggested she stay the night at his hotel, she didn't hesitate. "I'll have them get everything ready," he'd told her just 30 minutes earlier. His voice had that warm, familiar tone that made her feel like the luckiest woman in the world. Beth smiled to herself as she adjusted the strap of her canvas backpack and approached the front desk. The grandeur of the place didn't intimidate her. It never had. Her husband might be a billionaire hotel magnate, but she'd made it clear from the start, she wouldn't live a life of luxury for luxury's sake. She had purpose. Her calling was helping kids express themselves through art, not attending charity galas or lounging in designer clothes. The lobby was quiet, but elegant. A classical tune drifted from the grand piano near the fireplace. A group of guests in evening wear lingered nearby, sipping cocktails from crystal glasses. As Beth stepped up to the reception counter, she caught a glance from a man behind the desk. His name tag read Scott. "Good evening," Beth said with a tired but polite smile. "I'm Beth Carter. My husband, Richard Carter, should have called about a room for me." Scott's professional smile wavered for just a moment as he glanced over her paint-stained clothes and casual demeanor. In that instant, Beth felt something shift in the air, a subtle judgment. She'd seen it before. But tonight, she was too tired to let it get to her. All she wanted was a hot bath, a warm meal, and a few hours of peace before another long day tomorrow. Little did she know, the evening was about to take a sharp and painful turn, one that would reveal just how much the world still judged people by what they wore, and not who they truly were. Beth Carter stood patiently at the reception desk, her feet aching inside her worn sneakers. She offered a kind smile to the front desk clerk, a clean-cut young man named Scott Thompson, whose tailored blazer and name tag screamed corporate precision. A second employee, Lauren Davis, stood nearby, her posture straight and polished, like she'd stepped out of a luxury catalog. "I'm Beth Carter," Beth repeated gently. "My husband, Richard Carter, owns this hotel. He called ahead about a room for me." Scott's expression tightened. His eyes traveled slowly from her trucker cap down to the faint smears of blue and ochre paint on her jeans. Then he looked back up at her face, wearing a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Do you have identification, ma'am?" he asked, the skepticism in his tone subtle but unmistakable. Beth reached into her canvas backpack, rummaging past sketchbooks and pencils to find her wallet. "Of course." She handed over her driver's license, which clearly read Elizabeth Carter. Lauren leaned slightly forward, giving the ID a glance before raising an eyebrow. "And you said Mr. Carter arranged this?" Beth nodded. "Just half an hour ago. He told me to come straight here." They exchanged a look. Not just confusion, but doubt. Disbelief. "Ma'am," Lauren began, her voice overly polite, "this is a luxury property. Maybe there's been a mistake? There's another Carter Inn on the other side of the city." Beth's cheeks warmed. Not from embarrassment, but from indignation. "There's no mistake," she said, her voice still composed. "Richard Carter is my husband. He owns this hotel chain. I'm just here for a quiet night's rest." Scott's smirk barely stayed hidden. "Ma'am, Mrs. Carter is a public figure. She was just featured in Forbes in Town and Country last month." "I know," Beth cut in calmly. "I married her husband." A murmur rippled through nearby guests. A well-dressed couple paused mid-conversation to glance over. Lauren stepped forward, lowering her voice but raising her volume just enough for others to hear. "We get this from time to time," she said. "People pretending to be associated with the Carters. It's really not appropriate." Beth took a deep breath. She had dealt with microaggressions before. In classrooms. In board meetings. Even at school supply stores. But this, it was blatant. Dismissed, not for what she said, but for what she wore and how she looked. "Please check your records," she said, trying once more. "Or call Richard." Scott shook his head. "We don't just call Mr. Carter for walk-ins," he said, gesturing toward the growing line behind her. "There's a motel a few blocks down that may be more your style." Beth stood still. Around her, the elegance of the hotel seemed suddenly cold and distant. She wasn't just being turned away. She was being erased. What they didn't know, what they were about to learn, was that judging Beth Carter by her appearance was the worst mistake they could make. The moment was teetering on the edge of humiliation when the lobby doors whooshed open with a soft rush of air. Richard Carter, founder and CEO of the Carter Grand Hotel chain, strode in with the confidence of a man used to owning the space he walked into. At 45, with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair and a suit that looked custom-tailored to the inch, he gave off the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to announce himself. He had just arrived from a business trip and planned to surprise Beth with dinner. Instead, what greeted him was the sight of his wife being forcibly guided toward the exit by a security guard named Mike Reynolds, while curious guests watched the scene unfold like a drama they hadn't paid for. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Excuse me," he said calmly as he approached, placing a hand lightly on the guard's shoulder. "Is there a problem here?" Mike turned, instantly recognizing the man who signed his paychecks. His hand dropped from Beth's arm like it had touched fire. "Mr. Carter, sir, I didn't realize." Beth stood tall but clearly exhausted, her eyes meeting Richard's. She didn't need to explain. He saw everything in an instant, the judgment, the assumptions, the quiet humiliation she'd endured for simply not looking the part. "You can let go of my wife now, Mike," Richard said, his voice even. A hush fell over the room. "Your wife?" Scott, the front desk clerk, nearly choked on the words. Richard stepped beside Beth and put a reassuring arm around her. "Are you okay?" he asked her gently. "I am now," she said quietly. Lauren and Scott stood frozen behind the counter, their faces draining of color. The guests who had been watching exchanged stunned glances. The woman in the trucker cap and paint-stained jeans wasn't a fraud or a grifter, she was the wife of the man who built this place. "I'd like to understand exactly what happened here," Richard said, his tone now edged with steel. He looked at each employee, giving them a chance to speak, but none did. The silence was more damning than any explanation. Scott finally stammered, "We didn't recognize her, sir. We thought." "You thought what?" Richard interrupted. "That she didn't look like someone who belonged here. That because she wasn't dressed in silk or heels, she couldn't possibly be my wife?" No one answered. Beth squeezed his hand gently. "Let's not make a scene," she said softly. But Richard turned to the gathered guests and staff. "No, I think this is exactly the moment to make a point. Because sometimes, the most powerful lessons are taught not in boardrooms or training seminars, but right in the middle of the lobby, where everyone can see what dignity, love, and respect truly look like." Upstairs in Richard Carter's executive office on the top floor of the hotel, the city of Portland stretched out beneath the wide glass windows, sparkling lights against the early evening sky. But no one in the room was admiring the view. Beth Carter sat quietly in a plush armchair, her backpack resting at her feet, her posture steady despite the whirlwind she had just endured. Across the room stood Scott, Lauren, and Mike, the trio responsible for the earlier humiliation, now stiff with discomfort. Richard stood near his desk, hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. But he wasn't angry in the way they feared. No yelling. No threats. Just a deep, quiet disappointment. "I built this hotel chain from nothing," he began, voice steady. "My first property was a 28-room roadside motel outside of Seattle. I cleaned the bathrooms myself in those early days." He picked up a framed photo from his desk and turned it toward them. In it, a much younger Richard stood in front of that modest motel, mop in hand, smiling wide. "My father worked nights as a janitor. My mother waited tables at 2 diners. We didn't have much, but we were raised with respect, for ourselves, and for others. That's what this company was supposed to stand for." Scott shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Carter, we didn't know it was your wife. If we had..." Richard held up a hand. "That's the problem. You shouldn't have to know someone's title or who they're married to in order to treat them with basic dignity." Lauren's voice was barely above a whisper. "We were just trying to follow standards." "Whose standards?" Richard asked, his gaze piercing. "If our standard is to judge someone's worth by their clothes, then we've lost our way." Beth finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not angry with you," she said. "But I am troubled that you believe someone dressed like me didn't belong in a place like this. That kind of thinking doesn't come from nowhere. It's learned." Mike, the security guard, looked down at his polished shoes. "I was just following protocol, ma'am." "Then the protocol needs to change," Richard said. "Starting now." He moved behind his desk, not just as CEO, but as a man determined to make things right. "Tomorrow morning, I'm calling an emergency meeting of our hotel leadership. We're launching a complete retraining program, one that includes recognizing unconscious bias, and treating every guest with dignity, not just those who look the part." The 3 employees looked stunned, but relieved. "And before any of that," Richard added, "you'll each spend a day volunteering at Beth's community art program. You need to see the faces of the kids she works with, their potential, their strength. Then maybe you'll understand why what happened tonight matters so much." This wasn't about punishment. It was about growth. And in that quiet room high above the city, a seed of transformation was planted, one that would ripple far beyond the hotel walls. The next morning, the staff at the Carter Grand Hotel gathered in the largest conference room, some curious, others nervous. Word had spread quickly. Richard Carter himself had called a mandatory meeting. What happened last night wasn't just another managerial issue. It was a wake-up call. Richard stood at the front of the room, not with charts or sales reports, but with a message. Beth Carter sat beside him, her presence quiet yet commanding. Still dressed in her usual casual style, clean jeans, a cotton blouse, her trucker cap on the table beside her, she looked more like a beloved teacher than the wife of a billionaire. And that was the point. "We're not here today to point fingers," Richard began. We're here because something happened last night that revealed a deeper problem. Not with one person, but with how we think, how we assume, and how we treat people who don't look the way we expect." The room was silent. "We're launching a company-wide training initiative starting today. Not a slide deck or a 1-hour video," he continued, "but a program that challenges how we treat everyone, from our wealthiest guest to the delivery driver grabbing a glass of water." Scott, Lauren, and Mike sat in the front row. They'd spent the early morning volunteering at Beth's art program, working with a group of elementary school students from low-income neighborhoods. They had wiped paint off tables, helped kids mix colors, and seen firsthand how Beth spoke to each child as if they were the most important person in the room. "I thought I was just helping with an art project," Lauren admitted later. "But I realized I was watching someone build people up, one kind word at a time." Richard had made it clear, the three wouldn't be fired. Instead, they would become the first ambassadors of this new culture. Scott was tasked with working alongside the HR team to help develop the new training. Lauren would assist Beth in expanding the community outreach program. Mike would lead a review of all security protocols to ensure they were both firm and respectful. Firing them would have been easy, Richard told the team. But having them lead this transformation? That's more powerful. Beth nodded, her voice soft but steady. Everyone deserves a chance to grow, especially when they're willing to do the hard work of change. Some staff members looked surprised by the grace being shown. But others nodded in agreement. Many had seen or experienced moments like this before, subtle biases, silent assumptions, quick judgments. Perhaps not as public, but just as damaging. That morning didn't just mark a new policy, it marked a cultural shift. One that didn't just live in an employee manual, but in the hearts of those who had been part of it. And as Beth and Richard left the meeting room hand in hand, it became clear, they weren't just running a hotel anymore. They were building a legacy of human dignity, one lesson at a time. 3 months had passed since the night Beth Carter was nearly thrown out of her husband's hotel. But what began as a moment of humiliation had since sparked something far more powerful, a transformation from the inside out. Inside the grand lobby of the Carter Grand Hotel, the changes were unmistakable. Gone was the sense of stiff formality that once made the place feel more like a museum than a sanctuary. In its place was a warmth, an attentiveness that extended to everyone, regardless of what they wore or where they came from. Beth stood quietly near the fireplace, watching as Scott Thompson, the same front desk clerk who once dismissed her, now gently welcomed an elderly woman dressed in a simple house dress and orthopedic shoes. He smiled, carried her overnight bag himself, and even offered her a complimentary breakfast voucher just to make your morning brighter. It wasn't a performance. It was sincere. Beside Beth, Richard Carter appeared, his arm brushing lightly against hers. "Quite a change, isn't it?" he said with a quiet smile. Beth nodded, her eyes still on Scott. "And not just here," she added. "Guest satisfaction is up 23% across all properties. Turns out, treating people with dignity is good for business too." Richard chuckled. Who would have thought? The initiative they had started, Dignity for All, had rolled out to every Carter hotel in the country. Training programs were no longer about rehearsed phrases or forced smiles. They were about mindset, empathy, and learning to slow down long enough to see the person in front of you. What surprised everyone most was how Scott had taken on his role. Once defensive and proud, he was now the loudest advocate for the new approach, even requesting to bring the program to the company's overseas locations next quarter. Across the lobby, Lauren Davis emerged from the back office, walking beside a teenage boy in a wheelchair. His name was Marcus, a former student from Beth's art program. After her volunteer experience, Lauren had requested a permanent reassignment to the Community Outreach Department. Now, she coordinated internship programs that brought young people from under-resourced communities into real-world hospitality training. "Mrs. Carter," Lauren called out, her tone warm, "this is Marcus. He's starting his culinary internship today." Beth's face lit up. "Marcus has an incredible eye for color and detail," she told Richard proudly. "He once recreated Van Gogh's Starry Night using only crayons." Richard shook the young man's hand. "The executive chef is expecting you," he said. "We're glad you're here." At the far end of the room, Mike Reynolds, now the hotel's head of guest safety and hospitality standards, stood by the entrance, chatting with a bellhop. Security procedures had been overhauled, placing respect alongside readiness. Mike now trained all new guards using his own past mistake as a case study. From shame had come service. From error, empathy. And from one painful night, a movement was born, proving that sometimes the smallest moments can carry the weight of something far greater than we ever imagined. Late one afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind Portland's skyline, Beth Carter paused in the hotel's entryway and looked around. The once intimidating marble lobby, once a symbol of exclusivity, now felt alive, warm, welcoming, and full of quiet dignity. Across the room, Scott Thompson stood at the concierge desk, helping a young mother with 2 kids check in. Her stroller squeaked, and one of the toddlers had jelly on his shirt, but Scott's tone was kind and respectful, completely devoid of the judgment he had once so freely dispensed. Richard Carter, appearing beside Beth as if on cue, watched silently for a moment. "I barely recognized the man," he said. Beth smiled. "That's the best kind of change, the kind that starts from within." The transformation at the Carter Grand hadn't just been about damage control. It had become a guiding principle. What began as a personal stand against humiliation had evolved into a cultural shift, impacting not just one hotel but a nationwide chain. Policies had been rewritten, training updated, and community outreach expanded. But beyond the formalities, it was the personal changes that told the real story. Lauren Davis, once the polished receptionist who had looked down on Beth, now coordinated the hotel's internship program for underserved youth. She'd taken a genuine interest in the lives of the interns, even attending some of their family events. Her decision to leave the front desk hadn't been about avoiding shame, it was about stepping into purpose. "Mrs. Carter," she said that day, as she wheeled a cart of internship welcome kits into the lobby, "did I tell you Marcus got a full scholarship? He's going to culinary school this fall." Beth lit up. "That's wonderful. Please tell him how proud I am." A few steps away, Mike Reynolds stood at his post near the elevator. He now conducted monthly workshops for hotel staff and security teams across the region, using real-life case studies, including his own failure, to teach de-escalation and respectful engagement. Beth often thought back to that first night, how every word, every look, every insult had cut deep. But now, looking around the lobby, it was clear that none of it had been in vain. Richard turned to her as they began to walk toward the exit. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "this whole thing, it stopped being about us a long time ago." Beth nodded. "Exactly. It's about every person who comes through those doors and feels seen, respected, and valued. Whether they're wearing designer suits or paint-stained jeans." A nearby plaque caught her eye. Installed just last week, it read, "At Carter Hotels, we measure luxury not in chandeliers or thread counts, but in how we treat people." It was a small sign. But for Beth, it carried a weight that no expensive fixture ever could. And for every guest who passed through, it served as a quiet promise, "You matter here." It was a bright Saturday afternoon when Beth Carter and Richard stepped out of the Carter Grand Hotel, arm in arm, the sun casting soft shadows across the city sidewalk. Beth wore her usual attire, comfortable jeans, a cotton top, and her signature trucker cap, still the same woman who'd walked into the hotel 3 months ago and been told she didn't belong. Only now, she wasn't walking out alone or unheard. She was leaving behind something far greater than she ever intended, a lasting change. Inside, the hotel hummed with quiet purpose. Guests were greeted with genuine smiles. Interns from local neighborhoods were learning front desk operations, culinary arts, and housekeeping, not as temporary charity cases, but as future professionals. And across the lobby, a new bronze plaque stood on display. Its inscription read, "At Carter Luxury Properties, we believe true hospitality means treating every person with dignity and respect, no exceptions." Beneath the message was a quote Beth had chosen herself, from poet Maya Angelou. "We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike." It was a simple truth, but one often forgotten in the world of prestige and polish. As they walked past a street corner, Beth paused to admire a sidewalk artist sketching portraits in charcoal. His hands were weathered, his jacket frayed, but the depth in his strokes was undeniable. Beth knelt beside him, complimented his shading technique, and within moments, they were talking about art theory and the power of expression. The artist's guarded demeanor softened. He'd been seen, really seen. Richard watched the scene with quiet admiration. That was his wife, a woman who could build bridges with anyone, anywhere, not through status or wealth, but through kindness and connection. As they drove back to their countryside home later that evening, the city's skyline faded behind them. Beth sat quietly for a while, looking out the window at the pine trees lining the highway. "You thinking about what happened?" Richard asked gently. Beth turned to him and nodded. "I was just thinking about how something painful turned into something beautiful." He reached over and took her hand. "That's your gift," he said. "No," she replied, her voice soft but certain. "That's our gift now. And think about it, there are people walking into our hotels today, being treated with kindness, who may never know that they were once judged for how they looked. Because we decided to change things." Richard smiled. And to think, it all started with a tired art teacher in paint-stained jeans, just looking for a place to rest. Beth leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "Turns out," she whispered, "you don't need a fancy dress or diamonds to change the world. Sometimes, all it takes is standing your ground." And with that, they continued down the quiet road, knowing they had turned one moment of prejudice into a movement of grace, one guest at a time. One of the most profound lessons from Beth Carter's story is that dignity should never be determined by appearance, wealth, or social status. In a world where so much emphasis is placed on image and outward success, we are reminded that real worth lies in how we treat one another, especially when no one is watching. For older adults who have lived through decades of change, social, economic, and cultural, this story touches a familiar chord. Many of us know what it's like to be underestimated, overlooked, or judged unfairly. And yet, as we reflect on our own experiences, we recognize that true character is revealed not in comfort, but in challenge. Beth, a humble art teacher, stood her ground with grace. She didn't raise her voice or seek revenge. She chose integrity over outrage, and in doing so, became a catalyst for change that reached far beyond herself. Her story is a powerful reminder that small actions, rooted in respect, can spark big transformations, not just in businesses, but in communities and families. For those of us in our later years, it's easy to feel that the world is moving too fast or forgetting the values we hold dear. But stories like this reassure us that kindness still matters. that respect, fairness, and empathy are not outdated, they are essential. So the next time we encounter someone who seems different, let us remember Beth's quiet strength. Let us choose to see the person, not the clothes, not the circumstance. Because the most lasting legacy we leave behind may just be how we made others feel, valued, seen, and respected.